The ballroom at the Kensington Hotel was lit gold, chandeliers throwing soft light across 300 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, the annual Carter Holdings Gala in full swing, champagne flutes rising and falling, a string quartet working through something classical nobody was really listening to. Nathan Cole stood near the edge of the room in a rented suit that fit almost right, watching his CEO stand completely alone in the middle of all that noise. Emily Carter was 38 years old, worth more on paper than most of the room combined, and utterly by herself. Men in better suits than Nathan's kept approaching her in twos and threes, laughing too loud at things that weren't funny, angling for 5 minutes of her attention before drifting off when she gave them exactly that and no more. She held her glass like a prop. Her smile never reached past her cheekbones. Nathan wasn't supposed to be within 20 feet of her. He worked in facilities, 3rd floor, and he was only at the gala because his supervisor had a stomach bug and someone needed to babysit the building's HVAC readouts in case the kitchen overloaded a circuit again like it had last year. He'd changed out of his coveralls in a supply closet. He hadn't planned on talking to anyone important, but he watched her stand there, abandoned in a room full of people who wanted something from her, and something in him, the same instinct that made him notice a loose stair rail before anyone tripped on it, made him walk over. "Rough crowd," he said, nodding at the cluster of executives now migrating toward a hedge fund manager instead. Emily turned, surprised, maybe amused. You could say that. He didn't know her well enough to know what would land, so he went with what came naturally, a small, dry joke, the kind he'd used to diffuse a tense moment on a job site. He glanced around the room, at the men circling and retreating, and he smiled. "So who's the lucky man tonight?" He meant nothing by it. He meant it the way you'd ask a friend at a wedding who they were dancing with next. Emily didn't laugh. She looked at him for a moment longer than the joke called for, something shifting behind her eyes, and then she said, evenly, like she was answering a question about quarterly numbers, "I was hoping that would be you." The room didn't stop. The quartet kept playing. But Nathan's champagne glass, which he'd been holding loosely at his side, slipped half an inch in his hand before he caught it, the only outward sign that anything in him had jolted. He let out a short laugh, assuming she was teasing him back, matching his tone. She didn't laugh with him. To find out what happened next between the maintenance tech and the CEO who'd just said the truest thing she'd said all night, stay until the very end. If stories like this, about being truly seen by someone you never expected, mean something to you, we'd love to know down in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Nathan Cole didn't work at Carter Holdings. He didn't own a rented tuxedo. He was still learning, day by day, how to be a single father to an 8-year-old girl named Sadie, who had her mother's eyes and a habit of narrating her stuffed animals' entire emotional lives out loud at bedtime. Nathan had been a structural engineer once, a good one, the kind who got called in when other people's calculations didn't add up. He'd left that career behind after Sadie's mother passed, not because he stopped being good at it, but because the hours had stopped being possible. Sadie needed someone who came home at 6, not someone who was still on a job site answering emergency calls at 9. He'd taken the facilities job at Carter Holdings because it paid enough and it let him leave every single day at 5:15. No excuses, no exceptions. In time to pick Sadie up from the after-school program and read her 2 chapters of whatever book she'd chosen that week before her eyes finally gave out. He never told anyone at work about the engineering degree sitting quiet in a drawer at home. He never explained why he left exactly on time every day, never once used his daughter as a shield or an excuse, just quietly did his job well, and disappeared out the door before anyone thought to ask where he was going. It wasn't shame. It was simpler than that. He'd decided a long time ago that Sadie's life didn't need to be a story he told at work to get sympathy or slack. He handled it himself. Emily Carter, meanwhile, was 3 years into running the company her father had built, and nearly lost before she took it back from the brink. She'd inherited a name, a mess, and a board of directors who watched her, like they were waiting for her to fail, so they could say they'd told her so. She worked 80-hour weeks. She had not taken a real vacation since her 20s. She had dated, occasionally, men who wanted to be photographed next to her more than they wanted to know her, and she had gotten tired of the performance long before she admitted it to herself. She noticed Nathan the way she noticed anything that didn't fit a pattern, which was to say, professionally at first, almost by accident. She was leaving the building later than usual one evening, badge in hand, phone already lit up with the next crisis, when she saw him at the elevator, coat already on, glancing at his watch with a kind of quiet urgency that had nothing to do with clocking out and everything to do with somewhere else he needed to be. "Big plans?" she'd asked, mostly to be polite, not expecting an answer. "Bedtime stories," he said. "I've got about 40 minutes to make it across town." That was all. He didn't elaborate, didn't make it a bid for sympathy, just said it plainly, and got on the elevator when it came. Emily stood there a moment longer than she meant to, turning the phrase over. Bedtime stories, 40 minutes. A man who left work at 5:15 sharp, not because he didn't care about the job, but because he cared about something else more, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything for it. She started noticing him after that. Not obsessively, she had a company to run, a board breathing down her neck about a merger that would define the next decade of Carter Holdings. But in the way you notice a single fixed point in a room that's otherwise spinning. He fixed a flickering light outside her office without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. He remembered, apparently effortlessly, which conference rooms had thermostats that lied. He said almost nothing in meetings he wasn't required to attend, and when he did speak, people tended to stop and actually listen, though Emily couldn't yet say why. She didn't know, in those early weeks, about the engineering degree. She didn't know about the failure years before that had cost him nearly everything. Or the name that had been quietly erased from a project that should have carried his credit. She only knew that there was a man in her building who left on time every day for his daughter and never made it anyone else's problem, and that watching him do it, small as it was, had become the steadiest thing in her week. She had no idea, standing at that elevator with her phone buzzing in her hand, that the merger closing in 6 weeks, the one worth $400 million, the one that would either secure the company's next decade or bury it, was about to collide with a decision that would put Nathan Cole's quiet, invisible competence directly in her path. In front of the one man in the building who had every reason not to want anyone looking too closely at what had really gone wrong 3 years before Nathan ever set foot in this office. That collision was still 8 months away. Neither of them knew it yet, standing in that hallway with nothing between them but a closing elevator door. The Ashford deal was the biggest acquisition in Carter Holdings history, $400 million, 200 jobs riding on the transition going smoothly, and a board of directors who had made it clear, in language just polite enough to survive a transcript, that Emily's job depended on this closing clean. The final piece was a due diligence walkthrough of the company's flagship distribution facility, the one Ashford's engineers would be inspecting personally before signing. Derek Wallace ran that walkthrough. He was Emily's VP of Operations 44, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well, the kind of man who used phrases like optimize the narrative in ordinary conversation and had spent a decade being right just often enough that nobody checked his work anymore. He had built his reputation, in part, on a structural retrofit 3 years earlier that had saved the company millions. A retrofit that, in truth, Nathan Cole had designed before a rushed field decision Derek made against Nathan's written recommendation, caused a partial collapse during testing that injured 2 workers and very nearly killed a third. The company had needed someone to blame. Derek had needed someone to blame that wasn't him. Nathan, Jr., still grieving, with an infant daughter and no fight left in him for a battle that would cost a year of legal wrangling he couldn't afford, had let his name quietly disappear from the incident report and the credit disappear from the retrofit that followed once Derek's revised version, closer to Nathan's original design than anyone but Nathan ever knew actually worked. He walked away instead of suing. He took the facilities job under a different division a year later without anyone connecting the dots. He told himself it was for Sadie. It was. 3 years on, Derek was leading Ashford's engineers through the very facility his shortcut had once nearly destroyed, and something in the load calculations he was presenting, numbers he'd inherited from someone else's spreadsheet and never personally verified, didn't match what Nathan, standing quietly near the back of the group in his facilities vest because someone needed to open the mechanical rooms, could see with his own eyes. Nathan said something, quietly, to Derek off to the side, out of earshot of the Ashford team. He said the load figures on panel 4 didn't account for the retrofit's actual tolerance, that if Ashford's engineers ran their own numbers, they'd catch the discrepancy, that it would be better to correct it now than to have it surface during their independent audit. Derek's face did something complicated for half a second, before it settled into practiced calm. He thanked Nathan for his input, in front of 2 Ashford engineers who had drifted close enough to half hear, in a tone that made input sound like a favor Nathan had no business offering. Then he said, loud enough for the group, that he appreciated maintenance staff keeping an eye on things, but that structural tolerances were understandably a bit outside the scope of Nathan's role. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was dismissive in the specific surgical way that leaves no mark anyone else can see. The Ashford engineers chuckled, not unkindly, and the tour moved on. Emily heard about it secondhand, in the debrief that afternoon, framed by Derek as a minor moment of an overeager facilities employee overstepping during a high-stakes walkthrough. Embarrassing, he said, but nothing that had derailed anything. She should have asked more questions. She didn't, not yet, because the deal was closing in 9 days, and there were 400 other fires to put out, and because Derek had never once given her a reason to doubt him in 3 years. 2 days later, HR informed Nathan, in a 15-minute meeting with a woman he'd spoken to twice before, that his position was being eliminated as part of a departmental restructuring tied to the Ashford transition. Severance, standard, effective in 2 weeks, nothing personal. Nathan didn't argue. He'd learned, 3 years earlier, exactly how much arguing was worth against a story that had already been decided before he walked into the room. He didn't tell anyone the real chain of events. He didn't tell Emily, whom he'd spoken to maybe 4 times total, that the man running her biggest deal had built his reputation on Nathan's work, and had just quietly ended his employment, rather than risk anyone asking why a facilities tech knew more about load tolerances than the VP of operations. He went home that night, made dinner, and read Sadie 2 chapters of the book she'd picked that week, his voice steady the entire time, because 8-year-olds could tell when something was wrong, even when you didn't say it, and he wasn't going to let her carry it. Nobody at Carter Holdings in those first days understood what had actually been lost. Derek certainly didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as a loose thread, tied off cleanly. Emily thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as a minor personnel matter handled appropriately during a critical period. The true cost, the fact that the one person in the building who had caught a real structural error before it reached Ashford's independent engineers was now gone, his silence about it walking out the door with him, wouldn't be visible to anyone but Nathan himself for a long while yet. If you've ever been the one who saw the problem first and got pushed aside for saying so, you already know exactly how that Tuesday afternoon felt for Nathan, and if that's ever happened to you, we'd be honored to hear about it in the comments below. 8 months would pass, the Ashford deal would close, and life at Carter Holdings would move on as though nothing had happened at all, until a routine audit, buried in year-end paperwork nobody wanted to read, turned up a discrepancy in the very panel 4 load figures Nathan had tried to flag, and Emily Carter would find herself alone in her office at 11 at night, staring at a name on an old incident report she didn't recognize, wondering why it felt so familiar. The audit findings landed on Emily's desk on a Thursday in late autumn, 8 months after the gala where she'd said the truest thing she'd said in years to a man who no longer worked for her. It was routine paperwork, the kind an assistant would normally summarize in 3 bullet points, except this one had her name flagged for personal review, because the discrepancy touched the Ashford facility, and Ashford was, by then, threatening to pull a follow-on investment over a minor structural variance their own engineers had finally caught, 8 months late, buried under change orders and revised documentation Derek had filed in the weeks after the original walkthrough. Emily read the report twice. The numbers didn't just fail to match, they matched, almost exactly. A set of hand-annotated calculations from 3 years earlier, filed under an incident report, she vaguely remembered approving as a formality back when she was still learning which signatures actually mattered. The name on that old report's design credit had been redacted in a subsequent revision, replaced with Derek's, in a way that looked, the longer she stared at it, less like an update and more like an erasure. She called her assistant, Priya Nair, in at 9 that night. Not because it was Priya's job, but because Priya was the only person in the building Emily trusted to dig, without asking why before she had an answer worth giving. Priya pulled personnel files, incident logs, old project rosters, cross-referencing names against dates with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who'd spent 4 years learning exactly how much truth lived in the gaps between official documents. By midnight, she had it laid out on Emily's desk. The original 2023 retrofit design, hand-drawn calculations initialed NC, a formal recommendation against a modified installation timeline, overridden, a partial collapse during testing 11 days later, 2 injuries, and a final incident report that named nobody at all, closed out quietly. Credit for the eventual working retrofit assigned entirely to Derek Wallace. NC Nathan Cole. Emily sat with that for a long time after Priya left. She thought about a man at an elevator saying bedtime stories, 40 minutes, nothing more. She thought about the walkthrough 8 months earlier, Derek's practice dismissal, and Ashford Engineer's polite half-law. She thought about the fact that she had let a man be quietly fired for correctly identifying, a second time, the exact flaw he had first identified 3 years before anyone bothered to listen, and that she had approved it without asking a single real question. Because Derek had never given her reason to doubt him, and because she had been too consumed by a deal worth $400 million to notice that the deal itself was standing on a mistake nobody had ever actually fixed. She didn't sleep much that week. There was a second crisis stacked on top of the first. Ashford's board, spooked by the variance report, was threatening to trigger a clawback clause that could cost the company $11 million, and possibly the entire partnership. And Derek, when confronted privately, didn't crack so much as recalibrate, smoothly suggesting the discrepancy was a documentation error from years ago. Nothing that reflected on current operations. Nothing that needed Nathan Cole's name attached to it at all. He used the word optics 3 times in 4 minutes. Emily had heard him use that word for 3 years, without ever really hearing it before. She found Nathan's address through HR records she technically wasn't supposed to access without cause, told herself she had cause, and drove there on a Saturday afternoon in November, unannounced, in jeans and a coat instead of a suit, feeling more nervous walking up a stranger's front path than she had felt walking into any boardroom in a decade. Sadie answered the door first, 8 years old and entirely unbothered by strangers, informing Emily with great seriousness that her dad was in the garage fixing a bike, and that Emily could wait on the porch if she wanted, or come in and see her drawings, whichever. Nathan appeared a moment later, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his face unreadable when he saw who was standing on his step. Emily didn't dress it up. She told him what the audit had found, what she now understood about the retrofit, about Derek, about 8 months and 3 years, and every piece of it she'd been too slow to see. She offered him his job back, a promotion beyond it actually, his name formally restored on the original design, back pay, whatever settlement he wanted for what had been taken from him twice. Nathan listened without interrupting, the way he listened to everything, and when she finished, he was quiet long enough that she wondered if he'd say nothing at all. "I don't want a title," he finally said. "I want it to be true, on paper where it matters, so the next person this happens to isn't as easy to erase as I was. It wasn't cold. It wasn't forgiveness yet, either. It was something more exact than both. A man telling her precisely what would and wouldn't repair 3 years of silence, and asking for nothing more than that, nothing performative, nothing that made his daughter's stability the price of his dignity ever again. Emily drove home that night, turning his answer over the whole way, understanding for the first time that winning his trust was going to take considerably more than winning the Ashford deal ever had, and that she wanted it anyway, more than she'd wanted almost anything in years. 1 month would pass, quiet on the surface, before Derek Wallace, sensing the walls closing in, would make one final move to bury the truth for good, and it would be the evidence finder, not Emily, who caught him doing it. Priya Nair found the deleted files by accident, the way most real discoveries happen, not through some dramatic hunt, but because she was backing up an old server before a scheduled decommission, and noticed a folder that had been wiped clean exactly 9 days after Emily's visit to Nathan's house. A folder that had, until then, held 3 years of email correspondence between Derek Wallace and a since-departed compliance officer discussing, in language Derek had clearly believed would never see daylight, how to streamline the incident report following the original collapse. The recovered emails didn't just confirm what the audit had implied. They spelled it out in Derek's own words, an explicit instruction to remove Nathan Cole's name from the design credit, a private acknowledgement that the override of Nathan's recommendation had directly caused the collapse, and a final message, sent the same week as Nathan's termination 8 months ago, telling the compliance officer that the facility's situation had been handled and wouldn't come up again. Emily read every word standing in Priya's office at 7 in the morning, coffee going cold in her hand, and felt something in her that had been carefully professional for 8 months finally go sharp and still. She called Nathan that afternoon, not to ask him back this time, but to ask him something else entirely, whether he'd be willing to walk the Ashford engineers, in person, through exactly what the original retrofit should have been, using his own calculations, so the $11 million clawback threat could be resolved with the truth instead of another layer of cover story. He agreed on one condition, that Derek be in the room when he did it. The walkthrough happened on a Wednesday in the same facility where he'd been dismissed 8 months before, the same panel 4, the same mechanical room. Except this time Nathan wasn't wearing a facilities vest and nobody chuckled when he spoke. He walked Ashford's chief structural engineer through the original 2023 calculations from memory before he ever opened the folder Priya had printed for him, naming tolerances, load ratios, and the exact modification Derek had ordered against his written recommendation, with a precision that made the Ashford engineer stop taking notes twice just to stare at him. Derek tried, twice, to interject with the same practiced language he'd used for 3 years. Context optics, a difficult period for the company, and both times the Ashford engineer, who had spent the morning reading recovered emails with Derek's name at the top of every one, simply asked him to stop talking so Nathan could finish. By the time the walkthrough ended, the $11 million clawback was off the table, replaced by a formal, written acknowledgement of the original design error and its correction, credited, finally, to N. Cole. Derek didn't wait to be formally terminated. He resigned that same week, citing personal reasons, in an email that used the word optics one last time on his way out the door, and nobody in the building was sorry to see him go. What Nathan hadn't expected, and what unsettled him more than the vindication itself, was watching Emily during that walkthrough, not managing the room, not protecting the company's position, but standing quietly at the back exactly where he used to stand, listening to every word like she was trying to memorize the shape of what she'd almost let disappear a second time. Afterward, in the parking lot, she didn't offer him anything. She just asked plainly whether he'd let her make it right properly this time. Whatever that turned out to mean to him, on his terms, at his pace, no rush and no strings. He said he'd think about it. He drove home and read Sadie her 2 chapters and didn't mention any of it, because it still felt, in some private corner of him, too fragile to say out loud yet, too close to something he'd stopped letting himself want 3 years ago. What neither of them said that day in the parking lot, though both of them were quietly circling it, was that this had stopped being only about the retrofit and the credit, and the $11 million sometime back in November, on a front porch with an 8-year-old showing off her drawings, and had become instead about whether a man who'd spent 3 years protecting his daughter by staying invisible could learn to let one person see him fully again, and whether the woman who'd once said "I was hoping that would be you," without fully understanding yet what she was asking for, was actually ready to be that person. 6 weeks would pass before either of them said any of that plainly, and it would take one more small, unglamorous moment, not a gala, not a boardroom, just an ordinary Tuesday, for everything neither of them had said out loud to finally come out into the open. The company held a small internal ceremony in December. Nothing like the gala. No chandeliers. Just the engineering department gathered in a conference room on the 3rd floor, where Nathan used to fix flickering lights without telling anyone. Emily stood in front of maybe 40 people and read the corrected incident report aloud herself. Every word of it, including the 3 years it had taken to say it. And when she got to the part about who had actually designed the retrofit that had quietly kept the building standing for 3 years, She said Nathan's full name and didn't rush past it. There was applause, the ordinary, warm, slightly awkward kind that happens in conference rooms, and Nathan stood at the back the way he always stood at the back of rooms, and didn't perform anything for it. Afterward, Emily offered him, formally this time, the title of Chief Structural Engineer, a corner office, a seat close to hers on the org chart, and a public statement crediting him by name in the company's annual report. He turned down the office. He turned down the title, mostly. What he asked for instead was smaller and stranger to everyone but Emily, who by then had spent enough time with him to expect exactly this. A standing policy, written into the engineering department's procedures, that any employee's formal, written safety objection had to be logged, dated, and preserved permanently in a project's record, unable to be quietly edited out by anyone above them, ever again. He didn't want a title. He wanted the next person who saw something wrong and said so to be harder to erase than he had been. Emily approved it that same week, over quiet objections from 2 board members who thought it was excessive. She didn't care. It was the first policy she'd signed in years that she was genuinely proud of, and it cost the company nothing except the ability to bury a mistake the way it had once buried his. The quiet coda came 2 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday in February, nothing staged about it. Emily had taken to stopping by Nathan's house some evenings, not as CEO, just as herself, and that particular night she arrived to find Sadie in pajamas at the kitchen table, insisting that Emily, and not her dad, read the next chapter, because Emily Sadie had decided, did the voices better. Emily sat on the edge of Sadie's bed and read 2 chapters of a book about a girl and a dragon, who were both, in their own ways, misunderstood by everyone around them. And when she got to the last page and looked up, Nathan was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, not saying anything, watching her the way he used to watch loose stair rails and flickering lights, quietly, carefully, the way he watched anything he'd decided was worth protecting. Later, in the kitchen, over tea neither of them was really drinking, Emily asked him what he thought real worth actually was. After everything, the collapse, the erasure, 3 years of silence, 8 months of being let go for telling the truth twice. Nathan thought about it the way he thought about everything, slowly, without performing the thought for her benefit. It's the stuff that's still true when nobody's checking, he finally said. Whether anyone's watching or not. She didn't say anything back right away. She just reached over and took his hand, and he let her, and on the kitchen counter behind them sat the small brass level he'd kept from his old engineering kit, the one he still used to check whether a shelf or a picture frame was hanging true, a plain ordinary tool, the same one he'd been quietly, invisibly using to make sure things were level and safe for 3 years while nobody was looking, now sitting out in the open on Emily Carter's future kitchen counter instead of hidden in a drawer. If there's someone in your own life who's ever been like Nathan, quietly doing the right thing for years without anyone noticing, misjudged or overlooked before anyone bothered to really see them, we'd love to hear about them in the comments below, even if it's just to finally give them the credit they've earned. And if you believe quiet, overlooked people deserve to be truly seen, we'd be glad to have you stay with us for more stories like this one. Because somewhere, right now, there is probably a person in your life like Nathan Cole. Steady, unglamorous, doing the right thing whether or not anyone is checking, never asking for recognition because he stopped expecting it a long time ago. This story was never really about a merger or a retrofit or $11 million. It was about the difference between being useful to people and being truly seen by them, and about how long it can take, sometimes, for the second one to catch up to the first. Nathan Cole didn't want an office or a title. He wanted the truth on the record and his daughter's bedtime stories protected. And in the end, he got both, and something he hadn't let himself hope for besides. Thank you for staying until the very end.